Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So in this video, I'm going to quickly run through some Stephen King books that I think could be considered underrated. Obviously, it's a weird thing to say that any book by one of the most popular authors of all time could be considered underrated, but you gotta remember, the dude has written well over 70 books, and I'd say like most people who like either aren't King fans or are just casual King fans, they might know like 10, 15, maybe even 20 of his stories, whereas a lot of these go way under the radar for most people. Most of these books, or a lot of these books, are some of his newer books that he's written, this century. But there's a couple older books that don't get as much attention as stuff like The Shining, Misery, Cujo, It. They're way lesser known than those. And I might as well start out with possibly his most underrated, which makes sense because he wrote it under, the Bachman name. So already you got less recognition right off the bat. But even people who like Bachman books or have read all the Bachman books, they'd probably easily put this at the bottom, but it's always been one of my favorite Richard Bachman books, and that would be Roadwork. I can understand why people don't latch on to this book because it's not horror. There's not really any kind of supernatural element to it. It's basically just a 300-page character study about this dude named Bart Dawes, and there's not much to it other than that. But for people who enjoy King's more literary side, where he just really delves deep into his characters, I think a lot more people would like it, and I think a lot of people should at least give it a chance. And another Richard Bachman book, which is his last Richard Bachman book so far. I mean, I don't know if he's going to write more. Probably not. But the last one we have right now is Blaze, which actually came out in 2007. But King says that this was one of his trunk novels, and I think he originally wrote it in the 70s. So already right there, you're starting out on the bad side, where you're like, oh, well, I just literally put this in the trunk, and I didn't think it was good enough back then, but, I'm a famous author now, so let's just go ahead and release it. But it's actually really good, and it's one of my favorites from him. It's basically his version of Mice and Men, which I'm not a huge fan of that story, but I know a lot of people are, so, if you like that story, you should read this just to get Stephen King's take on it. And one thing I forgot to mention, another reason why a lot of these books on this list are underrated is because they don't have any adaptations. A lot of classic King books that everyone knows, even if they've never read it, they know it because there's a famous movie, either because it's really bad or because it's really good. But a lot of his underrated stuff have never gotten adapted, including this one and this one. And then the oldest novel that I have on this list that he wrote under his actual name, Stephen King, is The Dark Half, which this does have an adaptation, but not a lot of people have seen it, including me. It's one of the rare Stephen King films that I haven't seen yet, but I will be watching it soon because this book is actually really good, and it's a great example of King actually having like a great ending. Like, the ending was actually really good. it might be underrated just because this book was written in like 1989, and maybe people were getting kind of burnt out on King, because in the 80s, the dude, he wrote and published so many books. A lot of the times he was publishing 2 or 3 books a year, and so by the time people got to this, they were like, do I really need to read another King book? And then probably his most underrated short story collection is Just After Sunset. For me, it's probably not as good as his 2 earliest ones, Night Shift and Skeleton Crew, but it's definitely better than the one that came out before it, Nightmares and Dreamscapes and Everything's Eventual. There's some great stuff in here that people really should try, especially if you're a King fan and you've never read it. There's some really good stuff in here. Some standout stories in this one would be The Gingerbread Girl, Stationary Bike, N, just the letter N, The Cat from Hell, and A Very Tight Place. Those are all very good. And this might be the most controversial pick for my video because a lot of people do not like this book and they would put it easily near the bottom of their ranking list or whatever, but I really like it for what it is, and that would be The Colorado Kid. And it's pretty easy to say why people don't like this book. Number one, it's super short, and number two, you don't get really any answers. It's basically just people going over like a mystery, something that happened in this town a long time ago, and they're basically just trying to figure it out, but, you know, spoiler alert, in the end, you don't really get any concrete answers. And, you know, people don't like that, but that's the whole point of the story, is that you're never going to get all the answers. And it didn't bother me just because it's, you know, it's basically a novella. I don't think I would have liked it if it were like a full fleshed out novel and King was like, oh, well, you're not going to get any answers. But it's short enough to where it's just like, okay, we can kind of go over it kind of like a cold case, essentially. But you're not going to get all the answers. And then the next book I'm going to talk about is Duma-Key. This book isn't underrated in the sense that people don't enjoy the book, because a lot of people read this book and they put it in their top 10 King books, like I do. The problem is, not a lot of people have actually read it. I think a lot of people don't know about this book, again, because there's no adaptation to it. And that's a shame. I think this would make a really cool miniseries. Someone needs to work on that. But yeah, I think if more people actually knew about this book and went out and read it, it would be like up there with a lot of classic King books. The problem is, again, not a lot of people know about it. And then the next book I have to talk about is Finders Keepers, which is the second book in the Bill Hodges trilogy. The Bill Hodges trilogy is interesting because the fans are kind of all over the place with this series. A lot of people, you know, they like the first book the best, and then they don't like the rest of the series. Some people like the whole series, and they think all the books are 5 stars. For me, I like the first book. I think the second book is outstanding, and then the third book is awful. I did not like the third book. But a lot of people really like the third book because he introduces the supernatural element, and a lot of people, that's what they go for with King. But for me, just the first 2 books were fine without the supernatural element. And if you're going to introduce that in the third book in a series, come on. But the second book just the way that King like structures the story is just really good, and I read this super quickly. And the last book I have to talk about in my underrated King books is a book that came out last year, and it's his novella collection, If It Bleeds. Now, it's probably a little too soon to say that this book is underrated. You know, it came out not even a year ago, really, but it's already one of my all-time favorite King books, and I'd easily put it in my top 10. A lot of people would probably either disagree with that, or they just haven't had enough time to sit with it. And to be honest, I might be a little biased, because I think King is at his best writing novellas, and this is, you know, obviously a novella collection. All of the novellas in here are just tip-top, and they are just so good. Also, I kind of read it at a difficult point in my life, and it kind of helped me cope with reality while I was reading it, so that might have something to do with it too. I think that's all of the books I'm going to talk about today. Again, it's kind of hard to pick out underrated King books, either because they're super famous, or if they are underrated, I think they're bad books to begin with, so that's fine. But yeah. Anyway, what did you guys think of this underrated King video? What are some of your opinions on my picks, and what are some of your underrated King books that you think need more love? Let me know down in the comments below.